You apologize for wanting to be treated well. You round your standards down, again and again, until almost nothing is left. And you still feel guilty for the little that remains. Somewhere, a message got installed in you. A woman with standards is too much, and a woman with none is easy to love. But what if that guilt was never about you at all? What if it was built, on purpose, a long time before you ever met him? If you've ever asked for consistency, and then apologized for asking, you already know this feeling. You want to be chosen without conditions attached, and yet the moment you name what you need, texting back within a day, showing up on time, not disappearing for 3 days and calling it busy, something in you flinches. Voice says, don't be difficult. Don't be dramatic. Just be grateful someone wants you at all. That flinch is not weakness. It is not low self-esteem, in the way people casually throw the term around. It is something far more specific and far more programmable. Conditional self-worth. It's the quiet belief that your value as a person is not fixed. It goes up when you're easy, and it goes down the moment you have needs. And here's what almost nobody tells you. This belief was not something you arrived at by accident. It was shaped, reinforced, and rewarded long before you ever set a boundary with a partner. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly where that guilt comes from, developmentally, socially, and neurologically, and, more importantly, what it actually takes to unlearn it. Not surface-level advice like, just love yourself more, the real mechanics. Because once you can see the machinery behind the guilt, it stops feeling like the truth about who you are, and starts looking like exactly what it is, a pattern that can be interrupted. This isn't a video about low self-esteem in the vague, catch-all sense that gets thrown around online. It's about a specific mechanism, one that can be named, traced back to its origin, and, piece by piece, dismantled. And once you see how deliberately it was built, it becomes a lot harder to keep mistaking it for a fact about your character. Stay with me, because the next part is where most people recognize themselves in ways they didn't expect. Picture a woman, we'll call her Mara, a composite of patterns seen again and again in relationship psychology. Mara is smart, self-aware, financially independent. She can spot red flags in her friends' relationships from a mile away. And yet, when a man she's seeing goes quiet for 2 days, she doesn't get angry. She gets anxious. And then she gets apologetic. By the time he resurfaces with a lazy, hey, sorry, been busy, she's the one softening her tone, worried she came on too strong by texting, hope you're okay the day before. Why does a capable, self-aware woman shrink the moment her standards are tested? The answer starts earlier than dating. It starts in childhood, in the earliest lessons about what makes a person good. Here's layer 1. Many girls are praised, explicitly or subtly, for being agreeable, not for having opinions, not for saying no, for being easy. Easy to parent, easy to teach, easy to like. Boys, statistically and culturally, are far more often praised for assertiveness. Girls are far more often praised for accommodation. Over enough repetitions, a child's brain doesn't conclude, I was rewarded for this specific behavior. It concludes something much bigger. This is what makes me acceptable as a person. That's not a preference. That's an identity. But that's only half the story. Because identity alone doesn't explain why the guilt shows up specifically in romantic relationships with such intensity. For that, we need layer 2, attachment theory. If a child's early caregivers were inconsistent, sometimes warm, sometimes distracted, sometimes emotionally unavailable, the child doesn't learn, my needs are legitimate, and someone will meet them. She learned something more complicated. My needs might cost me connection, so I'd better minimize them to keep the relationship safe. Psychologists call this an anxious or fawn-oriented attachment style, and it's not a personality trait. It's a survival strategy that made perfect sense at age 6, and now runs quietly in the background at 30. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. That survival strategy doesn't stay in childhood. It gets carried, fully intact, into adult relationships. Except now, the stakes look like love instead of safety, and the guilt gets relabeled as being difficult instead of what it actually is. which is a nervous system trying to prevent abandonment. Then there's layer 3. And this one is almost invisible, because it hides inside romantic culture itself. Think about how often low maintenance is used as a compliment for women, and how rarely the same word is applied approvingly to men. Think about how many songs, films, and throwaway jokes frame a woman's needs as an inconvenience a man has to put up with if he really loves her. That's not neutral storytelling. That's conditioning. Repeated so often, it stops sounding like conditioning and starts sounding like common sense. And underneath all of it sits a neurological layer that keeps the whole pattern glued in place. Intermittent reinforcement. When affection is unpredictable, warm one week, distant the next, the brain's dopamine system doesn't calm down. It revs up. Unpredictable rewards are, neurologically, more compelling than steady ones. That's the same mechanism behind slot machines. So the very inconsistency that should be a red flag starts to feel, chemically, like chemistry. There's a fifth layer worth naming, because it's the one that keeps women from ever questioning the first 4. The sunk cost fallacy. The longer Mara invests emotional energy into decoding a man's silence, defending his behavior to her friends, and rehearsing hopeful explanations for why he hasn't called, the harder it becomes to walk away. Not because the relationship improved, but because she's already paid so much into it. Leaving would mean admitting the investment was wasted, and the mind will do almost anything to avoid that admission. So instead of cutting losses, she lowers the bar just enough to make the investment still feel worth it. Lower the standard, save the story. Childhood conditioning that says, agreeable equals acceptable. Attachment wiring that says, needs equal risk. Culture that says, needs equal inconvenience. A brain chemically hooked on unpredictability. A sunk cost mind protecting its own prior investment. 5 separate systems, all pointing the same direction. All training a woman to distrust the very instinct that is trying to protect her. Notice that not one of these 4 layers has anything to do with Mara's actual character, intelligence, or worth. Not one of them is evidence that she's too sensitive, or asking for too much. They are, every one of them, learned responses to real conditions she didn't weigh. Which raises the question this video has been circling from the very first line. If the guilt isn't proof you're wrong, what is it actually proof of? Here is the deeper truth underneath all 4 layers. The guilt you feel when you set a standard was never a signal that you're being unreasonable. It's a conditioned alarm bell, going off because you're black you. The doing something your nervous system was trained to associate with danger, taking up space. Think of it like this. Imagine you were raised in a house where the smoke alarm went off every time someone opened the gas. Even when nothing was burning. Eventually, you'd flinch every time you smelled food cooking. Not because there was actually a fire, but because your body learned to associate a normal, healthy action with imminent alarm. That's what's happening when you feel guilty for wanting a text back within a reasonable time, or for wanting someone to actually show up. The alarm is loud, the alarm is real, but the alarm is miscalibrated. It's responding to an old danger, not the one in front of you. This is why you can rationally know a standard is fair and still feel like a burden for holding it. Your logical mind and your emotional alarm system are running 2 completely different programs, and the emotional one is older, faster, and louder. This is also what's actually happening in the relationships where you feel yourself auditioning for basic decency. You're not overreacting to him going quiet. You're reacting to every earlier moment in your life when your needs were met with distance, instead of reassurance. And your body is using this relationship to replay that old script, hoping this time it resolves differently. That's not weakness. That's a mind trying to heal itself in the only way it knows how. Repetition, in the hope of a different ending. And here's the part that changes everything once you actually see it. The guilt doesn't prove your standard is wrong. It proves the standard is new. Guilt, in this context, isn't moral information. It isn't your conscience telling you you've done something bad. It's simply the friction of doing something unfamiliar to a nervous system that equated smallness with safety for years. New behavior almost always feels wrong before it feels right, because your body confuses unfamiliar with unsafe. That's true of anyone starting to lift heavier weights. anyone setting a boundary at work for the first time, anyone speaking up in a room that once punished them for talking. Discomfort is not proof you're doing it wrong. Discomfort is frequently proof you're doing something your old programming never allowed. So when you feel that familiar tightening in your chest after asking for what you need, the urge to soften it, retract it, apologize for it, that's not your worth shrinking. That's your oldest programming trying to protect a version of you that doesn't exist anymore. The 6-year-old who needed to stay agreeable, to stay safe, grew up. She doesn't need that strategy in a relationship with an adult who is supposed to be capable of showing up for her. But nobody sent your nervous system the memo, which means it's your job to send it now. And there's a cost to leaving that memo unsent. Every time the guilt wins and the standard gets quietly retracted, the lesson doesn't stay contained to that one relationship. It generalizes. The nervous system files it away as further proof of the original belief. See, I was right to expect less. And the bar drops a little further for the next man, and the one after that. This is how emotionally intelligent, capable women end up years into a pattern of shrinking without ever consciously choosing it. Not through one dramatic decision, but through 1,000 small retractions, each one small enough to seem reasonable in the moment, each one compounding into a version of love that asks for almost nothing and is grateful for almost anything. So how do you actually retrain a system that's been running the same program since childhood? Not with a slogan, with deliberate, repeated practice that teaches your nervous system a new lesson, the same way it learned the old one. Through repetition, not realization. First, separate the guilt from the truth. When guilt shows up after you state a need, don't ask, is this guilt telling me I'm wrong? Ask instead, is this guilt familiar, or is it accurate? Familiar guilt has a specific texture. It shows up instantly, before you've even finished the sentence. And it feels disproportionate to what you actually asked for. Accurate guilt is slower, more specific, and usually tied to something you did that actually harmed someone. Learning to tell these apart is the single most useful skill in this entire video, because it lets you keep the guilt that serves you and discard the guilt that was simply installed. Second, practice stating standards as facts, not requests for permission. There's a difference between, is it okay if I ask you to text me back sometime today? Sorry if that's annoying. And, I'd like a text back within the day. That matters to me. The second version doesn't ask the other person to approve of your needs. It states them, the same way you'd state your height or your job. Standards stop feeling like impositions once you stop presenting them like apologies. Third, track the pattern, not the moment. One inconsistent text doesn't tell you much. But if you zoom out and look at 3 months of a relationship instead of 3 days, the pattern becomes impossible to argue with. Intermittent reinforcement survives on your short memory. It needs you to forget last month's disappearing act because this week felt good. Keep the wider lens. Ask, over time, does this person's behavior match their words? Or am I averaging 1 great week against 3 forgettable ones and calling it love? Fourth, rehearse discomfort on purpose, in low-stakes situations, before you need it in high-stakes ones. Practice saying a small, honest no to a friend. Practice asking a coworker for something reasonable without a 3-sentence apology. Attached. Every time you tolerate the discomfort of a reasonable ask without collapsing it into guilt, you're teaching your nervous system, in real time, that having a standard doesn't end in abandonment. That's not a metaphor. It's how behavioral rewiring actually works. Small reps, repeated, until the new response becomes the automatic one. Fifth, and maybe most important, stop mistaking someone's comfort with your smallness for their love for your fullness. A partner who only seems to enjoy you when you want nothing from him isn't showing you love. He's showing you convenience. Real compatibility is tested by what happens when you do ask for something, not by how peaceful things stay when you don't. If a relationship only works when you disappear a little, that's not chemistry. That's a design flaw. None of this means becoming rigid, keeping score, or treating every relationship like a courtroom. It means recognizing that your standards were never the problem. They were the immune system, protecting a version of you that a lot of forces, over a long time, tried to convince to lower her guard. Every time you hold a reasonable standard despite the guilt, you're not being difficult. You're overwriting old code, one uncomfortable, honest moment at a time. And notice something important about all 5 steps. None of them require the other person to change first. That's deliberate. Waiting for someone else to make it safe for you to have standards keeps the power exactly where the old programming put it, outside of you. Rewiring starts on your side of the relationship, in how you interpret your own guilt, long before it ever requires a conversation with him. That's not a small distinction. It's the difference between hoping someone eventually treats you well enough that the guilt goes away on its own, and actively teaching your nervous system a new baseline regardless of what he does next. You were never too much for wanting to be met halfway. You were simply the first draft of someone who hadn't yet learned that her needs were allowed to exist without an apology attached. That version of you is still available. She's just been waiting for permission that was never anyone else's to give. If this explains something you've felt but never had language for, tell me in the comments. What's one standard you've apologized for having? And if you want the next video to go deeper into how to actually say these things out loud without the guilt creeping back in, subscribe, because that's exactly